June 9, 1944, Northern Italy. Lieutenant Marcus Williams of the 332nd Fighter Group banked his P-51 Mustang sharply to the west at 26,000 feet, the clear blue Mediterranean sky offering perfect visibility for what would soon become one of the most audacious aerial deceptions of the European theater. As his squadron prepared to escort bombers to a crucial oil refinery target, Williams checked his fuel gauges with absolute confidence that his plan would work flawlessly. The Germans would never expect what he had in mind. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the untold story of how one pilot's understanding of enemy psychology and radio procedures turned the tables on the Luftwaffe, saving dozens of American bombers and demonstrating how tactical brilliance sometimes matters more than superior numbers or firepower. Lieutenant Marcus Williams had never intended to become a war hero. Growing up in Philadelphia's bustling Germantown neighborhood, he had been fascinated with radio technology since his uncle gave him a crystal set for his 12th birthday in 1932. By 16, he was building his own amateur radio equipment and communicating with operators across the country. After completing 2 years at Howard University studying electrical engineering, Williams enlisted in the Army Air Corps in early 1942, determined to serve despite the military's segregation policies. "When Pearl Harbor happened, I knew I had to join," Williams later wrote in a letter to his mother. "They might not want us in the cockpit, but I figured my radio skills would get me in somewhere useful. Never imagined they'd actually let me fly." Williams was among the second class of cadets to complete training at Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama, earning his wings in November 1942. His technical background and understanding of communication systems quickly set him apart from his fellow pilots. While most focused exclusively on flying and combat tactics, Williams maintained a deep interest in signals intelligence and electronic warfare. Captain Robert Tresville, commanding officer of the 100th Fighter Squadron within the 332nd Fighter Group, recognized Williams's unique talents early on. "Lieutenant Williams sees the radio as more than just equipment," Tresville noted in a performance evaluation. "He understands it as a weapon system with strategic implications. His suggestions regarding our communications protocols have already improved our squadron's coordination." By early 1944, the 332nd Fighter Group had deployed to Italy as part of the 15th Air Force. The unit, composed entirely of African-American pilots and ground crew, faced not only the dangers of aerial combat, but also the persistent skepticism of military leadership, who doubted their capabilities despite growing evidence of their effectiveness. The group had recently transitioned from P-40 Warhawks to the far superior P-51 Mustang, an aircraft that would finally allow them to showcase their true potential. Oberleutnant Klaus Hoffmann of Jagdgeschwader 77 had been fighting in the Mediterranean theater since late 1942. A veteran of the Eastern Front with 18 confirmed kills, Hoffmann had been transferred to Italy to help counter the growing American bomber threat. From his perspective, the war was increasingly becoming a matter of mathematics rather than skill or courage. "The Americans simply overwhelm us," he wrote in his journal on May 23, 1944. "Today our Staffel intercepted a formation of 24 B-24s, protected by at least 16 fighters. We had only 7 aircraft available. 4 of us returned. This is not combat. It is a grinding machine." What Hoffmann and his fellow pilots didn't yet realize was that they would soon face not just numerical disadvantage, but also a tactical innovation that would amplify their sense of being outmatched. The brilliance of Williams' plan lay in its psychological foundation, a deep understanding of how the German fighter control system operated and how it could be manipulated. Technical Sergeant Raymond Johnson, the primary radio operator for the 332nd's ground control station, had worked closely with Williams to understand the Luftwaffe's communication patterns. Both men had spent countless off-duty hours listening to German fighter transmissions, despite neither speaking the language fluently. "We didn't need to understand every word," Johnson explained in a 1985 interview. "The rhythm and procedure told us plenty. Their ground controllers were very disciplined, specific call signs, precise intervals, standard phrases. That regularity made them predictable, and Lieutenant Williams figured out how to use that against them. Williams' plan began taking shape in May 1944, after a particularly costly mission where the 15th Air Force lost 17 B-24 Liberators to German interceptors. During the debriefing, he noticed how the Luftwaffe had effectively concentrated their limited fighter resources precisely where they were needed most. "They're not guessing," Williams told Johnson after the debriefing. "They know exactly where to be and when. Their ground control is vectoring them right to our formations based on radar and observer reports." The strategic implications were clear. If the Germans could be made to misallocate their fighter resources, even briefly, it would create a window of opportunity for Allied bombers to reach their targets with reduced opposition. But how could a single fighter squadron influence the decisions of the entire Luftwaffe air defense network? The answer came from an unexpected source, an intelligence report describing how German radar operators had difficulty distinguishing between different types of aircraft based on radar returns alone. They relied heavily on altitude, speed, and especially formation patterns to determine whether they were tracking fighters or bombers. "That's it," Williams said to Johnson during a late-night planning session. "If we fly in bomber formation patterns, but at fighter speeds, their radar operators will report a bomber stream. Then if we use enough radio traffic, their monitoring stations will think it's a major formation." The concept was elegant in its simplicity, but required precise execution. A small group of P-51s would fly in patterns mimicking bomber formations while generating enough radio chatter to suggest a large force. German interceptors would be scrambled to meet this phantom threat, drawing them away from the actual bombers approaching from a different direction. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., commander of the 332nd Fighter Group, was initially skeptical when Williams presented the plan. "Lieutenant, our job is to protect bombers, not play hide-and-seek with the Luftwaffe," Davis reportedly said, but Williams was persistent. "Sir, if we can draw off even half their interceptors for 30 minutes, that's 30 minutes the real bombers fly unmolested. The mathematics favor us. Even if we commit 8 aircraft to the deception, we can potentially save dozens of bombers and their crews." Davis, known for his methodical approach to tactical problems, considered the proposition carefully. As the son of the Army's first African-American general, he understood both military strategy and the additional burden his unit carried as representatives of their race. Any failure would not just be a tactical setback, but could reinforce prejudices about black pilots' capabilities. "How many aircraft and pilots do you need?" Davis finally asked. 8 P-51s, sir. I've already spoken with 7 other pilots who understand the concept and are willing to volunteer," Williams replied. "And the risks?" "Considerable, sir. Once the Germans realize they've been deceived, they'll commit everything to finding us. We'll need to have enough fuel and altitude advantage to escape." Davis studied the map of northern Italy, tracing potential flight paths with his finger. After several moments of silence, he looked up. "Very well, Lieutenant. Prepare a detailed operation plan. I'll take it to General Eaker, but I make no promises." To Williams's surprise, Major General Ira Eaker, commander of Mediterranean Allied Air Forces, approved the plan with minimal modifications. The operation, codenamed Phantom Strike, was scheduled as part of a major bombing raid on the oil refineries at Ploiești, Romania, one of the most heavily defended targets in Europe and a critical source of fuel for the German military. The days before the operation were filled with intensive preparation. Williams worked with intelligence officers to obtain the latest information on German radar coverage and radio frequencies. Technical Sergeant Johnson modified 8 radio sets to allow for rapid switching between frequencies, enabling the 8 pilots to create the impression of a much larger formation. Lieutenant Samuel Jefferson, one of the volunteers for the mission, later recalled the specialized training they underwent. "We practiced flying in bomber formation patterns, very different from our usual fighter tactics. It felt unnatural and dangerous. Fighters are supposed to maintain separation and maneuverability, not fly in tight, predictable patterns. But that was exactly the point, to look like bombers on German radar." The plan required the decoy formation to appear on German radar approximately 40 minutes before the actual bomber stream, approaching from the southwest while the real attack would come from the northwest. The timing had to be precise. Too early, and the Germans might have time to refuel and rearm their fighters after discovering the ruse. Too late, and they would not commit sufficient resources to the decoy. June 9th dawned with perfect flying weather, clear skies and excellent visibility. As the 8 P-51 Mustangs of Phantom Strike took off from Ramitelli Airfield at 06:20 hours, Lieutenant Williams performed one final check of his radio equipment. Each aircraft carried extra fuel tanks to extend their range, a necessity given the complex flight plan that would take them far from friendly territory. Captain Isaiah Roberts, the senior officer among the 8 pilots, led the formation. Williams, as the architect of the plan, flew as his wingman. As they climbed to altitude, the pilots maintained strict radio silence, saving their communications deception for when they entered German radar coverage. At 07:05 hours, as they crossed the coastline north of Rome at 24,000 feet, Williams gave the signal to begin the operation. The tight formation of 8 fighters expanded into a looser pattern mimicking that of a bomber group, with pairs of fighters maintaining positions that would appear on radar as a formation of approximately 24 aircraft. "Watchdog lead to group," Williams transmitted, using a fictitious call sign. "Maintain altitude and heading. Weather over target reported clear." "Watchdog 2 acknowledging," responded Lieutenant Jefferson from another aircraft. "Confirm approach vector unchanged." For the next 10 minutes, the 8 pilots maintained a continuous stream of radio chatter, discussing fictional equipment problems, formation adjustments, and weather observations, all designed to convince German signals intelligence that they were monitoring a large bomber formation. At the German radar station near Pisa, Feldwebel Werner Schumann noticed the formation approaching from the southwest. The pattern matched that of American heavy bombers, though something about the speed seemed unusual. "Possible bomber formation detected," Schumann reported to the Regional Defense Coordination Center. "Approximately 20 aircraft, bearing 225, range 120 kilometers, altitude 300 meters. At the Luftwaffe Command Center, Hauptmann Dieter Lange evaluated the incoming reports. With fighter resources stretched thin across the Mediterranean theater, every interception decision required careful consideration. The formation Schumann had detected was heading toward the important manufacturing center of Bologna, a frequent target for Allied bombers. "Direct Jagdgeschwader 77 to intercept," Lange ordered, "and alert the flak batteries along the projected route." At the JG-77 airfield near Bologna, air raid sirens wailed as pilots sprinted to their aircraft. Within minutes, 12 Messerschmitt Bf 109G fighters were airborne and climbing rapidly to intercept the approaching threat. Oberleutnant Hoffmann, leading the second section of 4 fighters, felt the familiar tension of combat as he adjusted his oxygen mask. "Control, this is Red 2, climbing through 4000 meters. Provide vector to target. Red 2, turn to heading 045, climb to 800 meters," the controller responded. "Bombers currently at 7500 meters, heading 055. As the German fighters climbed to interception altitude, Williams' formation continued its carefully choreographed deception. The 8 P-51s adjusted their flight patterns subtly, creating the impression that their formation was larger and moving more slowly than it actually was. "Watchdog lead to group," Williams transmitted. "Adjust formation. Number 3 Squadron, tighten up your interval." There was no Number 3 Squadron, but the transmission contributed to the illusion of a large bomber group. The German signals monitoring station duly recorded the transmission, adding to their conviction that a significant bombing raid was underway. Meanwhile, 175 kilometers to the northeast, the actual bombing force, 72 B-24 Liberators, escorted by 36 P-51 Mustangs from other groups, was approaching the Adriatic coast en route to Ploesti. Their route deliberately avoided the radar coverage that Williams' team was working to saturate with false information. At 07:28 hours, the German interceptors made visual contact with Williams' formation. "Control, this is Red Leader," reported Hauptmann Rudolf Weber. "Visual contact established, but these are not bombers. Repeat, these are fighters in bomber formation. Count 8 Mustangs." The revelation sent a jolt of confusion through the German air defense network. Hauptmann Lange at the command center initially thought there had been a simple misidentification. Red Leader, confirm. Only 8 aircraft. Confirmed. 8 Mustangs flying bomber pattern. Request instructions. Lang faced a difficult decision. Had they detected a small scouting force preceding the main bomber formation? Was this an escort that had lost its bombers, or was it something else entirely? While he deliberated, the 12 German fighters circled, maintaining visual contact with Williams' formation, but not yet attacking. This moment of uncertainty was exactly what Williams had hoped to create. Every minute the German fighters spent investigating his small formation was another minute they were not searching for the actual bombing force. Lieutenant Jefferson, flying on the formation's left flank, spotted the German fighters first. "Bandits, 3 o'clock high," he transmitted calmly. "Count 12 plus." Williams had anticipated interception, but the number of German fighters exceeded his expectations. "Acknowledge sighting," he responded. "Maintain formation for 2 more minutes, then execute Plan Baker on my mark." Plan Baker was the predetermined escape strategy, a rapid separation of the formation, with each aircraft taking a different heading to force the Germans to either divide their forces or choose which aircraft to pursue. The 2 minutes of continued deception were crucial, allowing the actual bomber formation to penetrate deeper into enemy territory. At the German command center, Hauptmann Lange was beginning to suspect a ruse. The continued radio chatter from the American formation contained references to bombers and target approaches, yet his fighters reported seeing only 8 Mustangs. Then, an urgent transmission from a radar station near Venice changed everything. Large formation detected approaching from the northwest, multiple groups, altitude 7,000 meters, range 90 kilometers. Lange stared at the situation map in dawning comprehension. "It's a diversion," he said to his operations officer. "The Mustangs are drawing our attention while the main force approaches from another direction." But the realization came too late. The 12 interceptors assigned to Williams' formation were now too far south to intercept the actual bombers before they reached their targets. Worse, they had burned precious fuel during their climb and holding pattern. "Red Leader, disengage from current targets," Lang ordered. "Return to base for refueling. Then proceed to Sector Bravo 7 to intercept primary bomber formation." On Williams' mark, the 8 Mustangs of Phantom Strike suddenly broke formation, each aircraft diving in a different direction. The German fighters, already low on fuel and now faced with new orders, could not effectively pursue. As Williams pushed his P-51 into a steep dive, he felt a mixture of elation and tension. The first phase of the plan had worked perfectly. They had drawn significant German fighter resources away from the bomber route. Now came the dangerous part, returning home safely through increasingly alert enemy airspace. The actual bombing raid proceeded with significantly less opposition than expected. Of the 109 German fighters available in the region that day, 38 had been dispatched to investigate various aspects of Williams's deception, leaving fewer aircraft to intercept the main bomber force. The result was one of the lowest loss rates of any Ploesti mission. 7 bombers and 3 escorts lost out of 108 total aircraft. For Williams and his team, however, the mission was far from over. Separated and flying individually through hostile airspace, each pilot had to navigate back to friendly territory while avoiding enemy aircraft and ground fire. They had planned multiple return routes, anticipating that their deception would be discovered. Lieutenant Jefferson took the most direct route, hugging the coastline at low altitude. Lieutenant Harold Brown chose to climb to 30,000 feet, above the effective ceiling of most flak batteries. Williams himself opted for an indirect approach, first heading east toward the Adriatic before turning south. German air defenses, now alerted to the deception, were actively searching for the dispersed American fighters. Williams encountered a pair of Bf-109s near Ancona, but managed to evade them through a series of tight turns that the German pilots, conscious of their fuel limitations, chose not to match. Lieutenant Edward Thomas was not so fortunate. Intercepted by 3 German fighters near Pescara, he was forced to ditch his damaged aircraft in the Adriatic. Though injured, Thomas was rescued by an Italian fishing boat and eventually returned to Allied territory. By 10:15 hours, 7 of the 8 Phantom Strike aircraft had returned to Ramitelli Airfield. The pilots gathered in the debriefing room, exhausted but elated by their success. The absence of Lieutenant Thomas dampened their celebration, but news of his survival arrived later that afternoon. Colonel Davis met with the pilots personally after the debriefing. "Gentlemen, preliminary reports indicate the Ploesti mission encountered significantly reduced opposition. Intelligence believes your operation directly contributed to this outcome. Well done." For Williams, the success of Phantom Strike validated his belief in the strategic importance of electronic and psychological warfare. The operation demonstrated that even a small force could have a disproportionate impact when employed creatively. The success of Phantom Strike did not go unnoticed at higher levels of command. Major General Nathan Twining, commander of the 15th Air Force, requested a detailed report on the operation for potential application in future missions. Williams was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, with the unusual citation acknowledging his innovative tactical planning rather than the more common recognition of courage under fire. The German response to the deception was equally significant. Luftwaffe Command in Italy issued new guidelines for fighter control, establishing more rigorous verification protocols before committing significant forces to interception missions. Radar operators received additional training in distinguishing between bomber and fighter formations. Oberleutnant Hoffmann, whose squadron had been among those diverted by the deception, later remarked in his war diary, "The Americans are becoming more sophisticated in their tactics. Today we chased shadows while their bombers struck elsewhere. Our resources are too limited to waste on such wild goose chases." For the men of the 332nd Fighter Group, Phantom Strike represented more than just a tactical success. It showcased their intelligence and creativity at a time when many still questioned the capabilities of black aviators. Colonel Davis ensured that reports of the operation reached the War Department, providing additional evidence of his unit's value. In the months following Phantom Strike, elements of Williams' deception tactics were incorporated into other 15th Air Force operations. Though never again executed at the same scale, the threat of deception forced the Luftwaffe to approach interception more cautiously, often delaying their response to radar contacts until visual confirmation could be established, precisely the hesitation that benefited Allied bombers. Lieutenant Williams flew 37 more combat missions before the war's end, adding 4 confirmed aerial victories to his record. His interest in electronic warfare continued, and he worked closely with intelligence officers to develop countermeasures against German radio navigation systems. The full impact of Operation Phantom Strike remained classified for decades after the war. When details finally became available to historians in the 1970s, it provided a new perspective on the innovative tactics employed by the Tuskegee Airmen beyond their well-documented success as bomber escorts. The events of June 9, 1944, illustrated a fundamental truth about warfare that transcended the technology and circumstances of World War II. That perception and deception can sometimes be more powerful than physical force, and that innovation often emerges from those operating at the margins of conventional military thinking. Major Wilhelm Krichbaum, commander of the German air defense sector that had been deceived by Phantom Strike, provided perhaps the most telling assessment in his monthly report to Berlin. "The enemy has begun to employ sophisticated deception measures that exploit our procedural weaknesses. Our response systems are designed for straightforward threats and become vulnerable when the enemy behaves unpredictably. We must adapt or face increasing ineffectiveness." For Marcus Williams, the success of his plan validated his unconventional approach to aerial warfare. While most fighter pilots focused exclusively on flying and fighting skills, his background in radio technology had allowed him to see possibilities that others missed. It was a lesson he would carry into his post-war career as an electronics engineer. 20 years after the war, at a reunion of the 322nd Fighter Group, Williams reconnected with Samuel Jefferson, who had flown with him on Phantom Strike. "You know," Jefferson said, "I think what we did that day saved more lives than all our regular escort missions combined, but hardly anyone outside the unit ever knew about it." Williams nodded. Sometimes the most effective operations are the ones that make the least noise. The strategic implications of Williams' approach extended far beyond that single mission. The operation demonstrated how asymmetric tactics could offset numerical disadvantages, a concept that would become increasingly relevant as warfare evolved in the latter half of the 20th century. A small force, creatively employed, could disrupt the operations of a much larger opponent by attacking not its physical capabilities, but its decision-making process. In the final analysis, Phantom Strike succeeded because it exploited a fundamental vulnerability in any military system: the gap between detection and verification. By inserting false information into that gap, Williams and his team created a window of opportunity that allowed the main bombing force to achieve its objectives with reduced losses. Back in the United States, news of the Tuskegee Airmen's exploits was gradually changing public perception of black military service. While the specific details of operations like Phantom Strike remained classified, the overall success of the 332nd Fighter Group became a powerful argument against military segregation. When President Truman finally issued Executive Order 9981 in 1948, desegregating the armed forces, the performance of units like the 332nd had helped pave the way. For Sergeant Raymond Johnson, who had helped develop the radio deception aspect of Williams' plan, the experience influenced his post-war career in broadcasting. What we learned about manipulating radio signals during the war translated directly to commercial broadcasting, he explained in a 1985 interview. The principles were the same: understanding how signals propagate and how listeners respond to them. The human aspect of Phantom Strike extended beyond the immediate participants. The bomber crews who benefited from the reduced German opposition never knew that 8 fighters had deliberately drawn away enemy interceptors. The German pilots who were deceived experienced frustration that contributed to the gradual erosion of Luftwaffe morale, and the ground crews at Ramitelli who prepared the aircraft had no knowledge of the special mission until after its successful completion. Lieutenant Edward Thomas, who had been forced to ditch his aircraft during the return journey, spent 3 weeks evading capture before making contact with Italian partisans who helped him return to Allied lines. His experience became a case study in survival training for future pilots. The most important lesson, Thomas later told cadets at Tuskegee, was to trust the local resistance. Without their help, I would have been captured within days. The technical aspects of Phantom Strike foreshadowed developments in electronic warfare that would become central to military operations in later decades. The deliberate manipulation of enemy sensor and communication systems, what would later be called information warfare, was still in its infancy during World War II. Williams' operation demonstrated its potential effectiveness even with the relatively simple technology of the time. Colonel Davis, in his post-war assessment of the 322nd's operations, highlighted Phantom Strike as an example of the kind of innovative thinking that emerged when individuals from diverse backgrounds were given the opportunity to contribute to military planning. Lieutenant Williams brought perspectives shaped by his civilian experience with radio technology. Davis wrote, "This kind of cross-fertilization of ideas is only possible when we draw talent from the widest possible pool." The legacy of Phantom Strike extended into the early Cold War period, when both American and Soviet military planners studied deception operations from World War II for insights applicable to the new strategic environment. The concept of creating phantom radar targets would eventually lead to the development of sophisticated electronic countermeasures and decoys designed to confuse enemy air defense systems. For the individual pilots who participated in the mission, Phantom Strike represented a rare opportunity to directly influence strategic outcomes. Most fighter missions, while certainly dangerous, had limited strategic impact. A pilot might shoot down enemy aircraft or protect bombers, but rarely did the actions of 8 fighters affect an entire air campaign. This operation allowed them to see the bigger picture of the air war. Captain Isaiah Roberts, who led the formation that day, reflected on this aspect during a 1990 interview. "Most days we just flew where they told us to fly and fought when we had to fight. With Phantom Strike, we were part of something bigger, something that required us to understand the enemy's entire air defense system and how to manipulate it. It felt different, more like chess than boxing. The psychological dimension of the operation had particular significance. In 1944, the Luftwaffe was already facing severe challenges: fuel shortages, mounting pilot losses, and the overwhelming numerical superiority of Allied air forces. Operations like Phantom Strike intensified these pressures by forcing German commanders to question their information and decision-making processes. Each false alarm and wasted sortie contributed to a sense of fighting a losing battle against an increasingly sophisticated opponent. Williams's personal journey reflected the broader experience of many Tuskegee airmen. Growing up in a society that systematically underestimated black intellectual and leadership capabilities, he found in military service both opportunity and constraint. The Army Air Forces provided training and resources that would have been difficult to access in civilian life, but within a rigidly segregated structure that reflected the prejudices of American society. The irony, Williams later wrote, was that the very military that restricted us to our own units also gave us the chance to prove those restrictions were based on false assumptions. Every successful mission was both a tactical victory against the Germans and a moral victory against discrimination. The technical success of Phantom Strike depended on Williams' deep understanding of radio technology and procedures. Before the war, amateur radio had been one of the few technical fields relatively open to black participation. The skills developed in that community, technical knowledge, procedural discipline, and the ability to improvise with limited resources, proved directly applicable to military operations. Sergeant Johnson, who had worked with Williams on the radio aspects of the mission, came from a similar background. "Back home, ham radio operators didn't care what color you were," he recalled. "On the air, you were just a call sign and a voice. What mattered was your technical skill and operating procedure. Lieutenant Williams and I both learned radio that way, and it gave us a perspective the military training didn't emphasize." The operational security surrounding Phantom Strike was remarkably effective. German intelligence never fully understood what had happened on June 9th, attributing the reduced effectiveness of their interceptions to various factors, including possible radar malfunctions. Even within the Allied command structure, knowledge of the operation was limited to those with a direct need to know. This compartmentalization of information, while necessary for security, meant that the full story of Phantom Strike remained untold for decades. Many of the bomber crews whose lives were potentially saved by the operation never knew of its existence. The mission received no publicity during the war, in contrast to the more visible accomplishments of the Tuskegee Airmen as bomber escorts. The mission's success also highlighted the potential of integrating signals intelligence with tactical air operations, a combination that would become increasingly important in later conflicts. By monitoring German radio transmissions and understanding their procedures, Williams and Johnson had identified vulnerabilities that were not apparent from conventional military analysis. The human cost of the air war provided the backdrop for Phantom Strike's significance. By June 1944, American bomber crews were suffering unsustainable loss rates in their campaign against German industrial targets. Each bomber shot down represented not just a lost aircraft, but the death or capture of up to 10 trained airmen. Operations that reduced these losses, even marginally, had a compounding effect on the Allied ability to maintain air operations. For Williams, this human dimension was always foremost in his planning. "The mathematics of warfare can seem cold," he wrote in a 1985 retrospective, "but behind every number was a man with a family waiting for him to come home. If our deception saved even one bomber and its crew, the risk we took was justified." The influence of Phantom Strike on subsequent air operations extended beyond the specific tactics employed. It demonstrated the value of allowing frontline officers to contribute to operational planning based on their specialized knowledge and observations. This principle, that tactical innovation often comes from those directly engaged with the enemy, would be increasingly recognized in post-war military doctrine. Technical Sergeant Johnson's contribution to the mission represented another important aspect of the 302nd's success, the crucial role of ground personnel in supporting air operations. While pilots received most of the public recognition, The maintenance, communications, and logistics specialists were equally essential to the unit's effectiveness. Johnson's expertise in radio systems made Williams's plan technically feasible. "A fighter group is like an iceberg," Colonel Davis often told visitors to Ramitelli. "The pilots are just the visible 10%. The other 90%, the mechanics, armorers, radio operators, and all the rest, make everything possible." The success of Phantom Strike ultimately depended on this entire support structure. The aircraft needed to be in perfect mechanical condition for the mission's demanding flight profile. The radio equipment required special modification to allow the deception to work. Intelligence officers provided crucial information about German procedures and frequencies. Each component had to function flawlessly for the plan to succeed. As the war in Europe moved toward its conclusion, the lessons of operations like Phantom Strike informed the planning for the final campaigns against Germany. The integration of deception operations with conventional air tactics became more sophisticated, though few subsequent missions matched the elegance and economy of Williams's approach. The post-war careers of Phantom Strike's participants reflected both the opportunities and continuing challenges faced by black veterans. Marcus Williams used the GI Bill to complete his electrical engineering degree at Howard University, and went on to work for RCA, contributing to the development of color television technology. Samuel Jefferson became an attorney, often representing veterans in cases against the Veterans Administration. Edward Thomas, after recovering from injuries sustained during his ditching, returned to his hometown of Chicago and became a commercial pilot for a cargo airline, one of the few aviation careers open to black pilots in the immediate post-war period. Colonel Davis continued his military career, becoming the first black general in the United States Air Force in 1954. He never forgot the lessons of commanding the 332nd, particularly the importance of allowing talented subordinates to apply their special skills and knowledge. Throughout his later career, he advocated for both racial integration and intellectual diversity in military planning. Technical Sergeant Johnson returned to civilian broadcasting after the war, eventually becoming chief engineer for a radio station in Detroit. He maintained contact with Williams, and the two men occasionally collaborated on articles about electronic communications for technical journals, drawing on their wartime experiences while respecting classification restrictions. The full details of Phantom Strike remained classified until 1974, when documents related to the operation were included in a broader declassification of World War II air operations. By that time, most histories of the Tuskegee Airmen had already been written, focusing primarily on their more visible role as bomber escorts. The operation thus remained relatively unknown, even as public recognition of the Tuskegee Airmen's overall contribution to the war effort grew. Williams himself rarely spoke publicly about the mission, preferring to emphasize the collective achievements of the 332nd rather than his individual contribution. When asked about Phantom Strike in a 1980 interview, he deflected. "It was just one mission among hundreds. Every man in the unit did his part day after day. That's what made the difference, not any single operation." This modesty was characteristic of many Tuskegee Airmen, who often downplayed their individual accomplishments while emphasizing their unit's collective performance. They understood that their success or failure would affect opportunities for all black Americans, not just themselves. The tactical innovation represented by Phantom Strike had particular significance in this context. It demonstrated not just courage, which racist stereotypes sometimes conceded to black Americans, but intellectual creativity and technical sophistication, qualities that segregationists typically denied. Each success achieved through planning and innovation, rather than merely physical courage, represented a double victory, against the external enemy and against domestic prejudice. As Williams later explained to a group of students at Howard University, they expected us to fail, or at best to succeed only by following established procedures exactly. When we developed our own tactics and succeeded with them, it challenged the entire framework of assumptions about what we could and couldn't do. The broader historical context of Phantom Strike included ongoing efforts by civil rights organizations to use black military service as leverage for social change. The Double V campaign, victory over fascism abroad and discrimination at home, explicitly linked wartime service to the fight for equal rights. Operations like Phantom Strike, though classified during the war, contributed to the growing body of evidence that segregation hindered rather than helped military effectiveness. For the bomber crews who flew to Ploesti on June 9, 1944, the unusually light opposition they encountered seemed simply a stroke of good fortune. Lieutenant Robert Ferguson, a B-24 pilot with the 450th Bomb Group who participated in the raid, recorded in his mission log, "Flak moderate, fighter opposition lighter than expected. Only brief encounters with Mi-109s after target. All aircraft in our squadron returned safely, a welcome change from recent missions." Ferguson and his fellow bomber crews never knew that 8 P-51s from the 382nd had deliberately drawn away German fighters that might otherwise have intercepted them. This invisibility was the mark of the operation's success. Its effects were felt through what did not happen rather than what did. The story of Phantom Strike is thus a reminder of the many unsung contributions that shaped the outcome of World War II. Behind the well-documented battles and campaigns were countless smaller operations, often highly classified, that influenced events in ways visible only in the final results. For the Tuskegee Airmen, whose achievements were often overlooked or minimized in early histories of the air war, operations like Phantom Strike represented both tactical innovation and symbolic importance. Each successful mission demonstrated not just their combat effectiveness, but their intellectual and leadership capabilities at a time when these were routinely questioned. The legacy of Marcus Williams and his fellow pilots extends beyond the specific events of June 9, 1944. Their willingness to challenge conventional tactical thinking, to apply technical knowledge creatively to military problems, and to accept calculated risks for strategic advantage, exemplified the qualities that eventually made air power a dominant factor in modern warfare. As Williams himself observed in his final interview before his death in 2008, "The real victory wasn't just that we fought as well as anyone else. It was that we thought as well as anyone else, and sometimes, as with Phantom Strike, we thought differently and better." That's what really challenged the system of segregation, because it was built on the false idea that we couldn't think for ourselves. The 8 P-51 Mustangs of Phantom Strike returned to Ramitelli Airfield as individual aircraft, spread over several hours, deliberately avoiding the formation flying that had been central to their deception. As each pilot touched down and taxied to the dispersal area, ground crew gathered around, curious about the special mission they had departed for before dawn. Security requirements prevented the pilots from sharing details, but their expressions told the ground crew enough. Something significant had happened, something successful. In the officers' club that evening, the participants in Phantom Strike celebrated quietly among themselves, aware that their achievement would remain largely unknown outside a small circle. Colonel Davis visited briefly, offering a simple toast: to innovation and execution. The pilots understood his meaning. They had not just carried out orders, but had created something new, something that might change how the air war was fought. For Marcus Williams, watching his fellow pilots relax after the tension of the mission, there was profound satisfaction in seeing an idea transformed into successful action. His understanding of radio technology, German procedures, and the psychology of air defense had combined to create an operation greater than the sum of its parts. The true measure of Phantom Strike's success came weeks later, when analysis of bomber losses over several months showed a significant dip corresponding to the period when German fighter controllers were implementing new verification procedures in response to the June 9th deception. The tactical innovation had produced strategic effects extending far beyond the single mission. In the broader history of World War II, Phantom Strike remains a footnote, one creative operation among thousands conducted by Allied air forces. Yet in its elegant use of limited resources to achieve disproportionate results, it exemplifies the kind of tactical thinking that ultimately overcame a formidable enemy. For the Tuskegee Airmen, facing both external foes and internal discrimination, such innovations carried additional significance. Each success achieved through intellect, rather than mere courage, challenged the racist assumptions underlying military segregation. Phantom Strike demonstrated not just that black pilots could fly and fight effectively, but that they could think creatively about the application of air power. The radar operators, fighter controllers, and pilots of the Luftwaffe who were deceived that day never knew the full story of what had happened or who had orchestrated their confusion. For them, it was simply another frustrating episode in an increasingly desperate defense against overwhelming Allied air power. But for Marcus Williams and the 7 other pilots who executed his plan, Phantom Strike represented something more profound, a moment when their special knowledge and perspective allowed them to see possibilities that others had missed. It was a victory not just of arms, but of minds, and a vindication of their right to contribute fully to the war effort, despite the barriers of segregation. As the war in Europe moved toward its conclusion, the techniques pioneered in operations like Phantom Strike became part of the growing American advantage in tactical air operations. The integration of signals intelligence, electronic warfare, and tactical deception with conventional air power created synergies that the Luftwaffe, increasingly constrained by fuel and pilot shortages, could not match. The 8 pilots who flew Phantom Strike continued their combat tours, returning to the more conventional but equally important work of escorting bombers and attacking ground targets. Their special mission remained classified, mentioned in official records only in vague terms that concealed its innovative nature. This pattern, black achievement obscured by classification, operational security, and the prevailing narrative that emphasized white contributions to the war effort, was repeated throughout World War II. Only decades later, as documents were declassified and historians began to examine previously overlooked units and operations, did a more complete picture emerge of how Americans of all races had contributed to victory. For Marcus Williams, this delayed recognition held both frustration and hope. "Eventually, the truth comes out," he told a historian in 2000, "maybe not in your lifetime, but eventually. And when it does, it changes how people think about what was possible and what was done." His words proved prophetic. The declassification of records related to operations like Phantom Strike contributed to a re-evaluation of the Tuskegee Airmen's contribution to the air war in Europe. Beyond their well-documented success as bomber escorts, these records revealed their role in developing innovative tactics and techniques that influenced broader air operations. The story of Phantom Strike thus stands as both a specific historical episode and a symbol of the often hidden contributions that shaped the outcome of World War II. Behind the well-known battles and campaigns were countless smaller operations, many highly classified, that influenced events in ways visible only in the final results. For the Tuskegee Airmen, whose achievements were often overlooked or minimized in early histories of the air war, operations like Phantom Strike represented both tactical success and symbolic importance. Each mission demonstrated not just their combat effectiveness, but their intellectual and leadership capabilities at a time when these were routinely questioned. The legacy of Marcus Williams and his fellow pilots extends beyond the specific events of June 9, 1944. Their willingness to challenge conventional tactical thinking, to apply technical knowledge creatively to military problems, and to accept calculated risks for strategic advantage, exemplified the qualities that ultimately made air power a decisive factor in modern warfare. When Williams died in 2008 at the age of 88, his obituary in the Washington Post made only passing reference to his wartime service, noting that he had flown with the 322nd Fighter Group and had been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. The specifics of Phantom Strike, still unfamiliar to most Americans, went unmentioned. Yet among military historians, and the dwindling number of Tuskegee Airmen still living, Williams was remembered for his innovative thinking and technical knowledge that had created one of the war's most elegant deception operations. At his funeral, a former colleague placed a small model of a P-51 Mustang on his coffin, a quiet acknowledgement of his contribution to air power history. The story of Phantom Strike, once classified and later overshadowed by more dramatic accounts of air combat, gradually found its place in the broader narrative of World War II. Military academies began including it in courses on tactical innovation and the integration of electronic warfare with conventional operations. The Air Force Historical Research Agency preserved the original operational planning documents, making them available to researchers studying the development of American air power doctrine. For the families of the bomber crews who flew to Ploesti on June 9, 1944, many of whom returned safely due in part to the reduced German fighter opposition, the details of Phantom Strike offered a belated explanation for their loved ones' survival. Some sought out the remaining participants to express their gratitude decades after the events. The operation's significance extended beyond its immediate tactical success. By demonstrating the potential of integrating electronic deception with conventional air operations, it influenced the development of what would later be called information warfare, the systematic attempt to manipulate an adversary's understanding of the battlefield situation. In this sense, Marcus Williams and his team were pioneers of concepts that would become central to military operations in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Their creative use of radio deception to influence enemy decision-making anticipated developments that would transform warfare in the information age. For the Tuskegee Airmen as a group, the gradually emerging details of operations like Phantom Strike added new dimensions to their already significant legacy. Beyond their courage in combat and persistence in the face of discrimination, these operations highlighted their intellectual contribution to the development of air power. This broader understanding of their role helped challenge persistent myths about black military service. Myths that emphasized physical courage while downplaying intellectual and leadership contributions. The full story of the Tuskegee Airmen, including operations like Phantom Strike, revealed their comprehensive contribution to all aspects of air warfare. As American society continues to reckon with its history of racial discrimination and segregation, the story of Marcus Williams and Phantom Strike offers an instructive perspective. It illustrates both the waste inherent in segregation, the talents restricted and opportunities denied, and the remarkable achievements possible when artificial barriers are overcome, even partially. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.